Voice of the Cape drive time. Going places. Getting there.
It's 4:39 on the Voice of the Cape. Welcome back to the show. I'm Tasneem standing in for Shafiq this afternoon. Now, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation has condemned and expressed deep concern regarding the scale of violence in Jonglei state in South Sudan, which has seen the recent killing of UN peacekeepers, SPLA troops, members of David Yau Yau's armed group, and civilians. Reports suggest that the Sudan People's Liberation Army and armed newer youth are poised to confront more civilians along the Nanam River with the potential outcome of casualties on all sides. Online we have Friederike Bubenzer, and she's the project leader for the South Sudan desk at IJR. She's worked in the region for the past 4 years. Friederike, a very good afternoon and welcome to Drive Time.
Thank you, Tasneem. Thanks for having us on the show.
No problem. First of all, take us through what you've been hearing on the ground in South Sudan. How do we make sense of what is happening there right now?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I should just say to begin with that we really appreciate the fact that you're giving us a platform to sort of voice this situation and put it out into the public, because there's been a sort of worrying silence around this issue, both in South Africa and globally.
Yes.
And so it's wonderful that we can share some information with you. Yeah, the situation has sort of been ongoing. As you know, South Sudan gained independence from Sudan in 2011, and we've seen sort of interim periods of peace, but in Jonglei state in particular, we've been seeing ongoing violence between a number of tribes. The Dinka are sort of on the sidelines. More prominent are the Nuer tribe and a significantly smaller tribe, the Morle. And ongoing conflict in the area has really involved cattle raiding, which is an age-old tradition in this area. It's certainly propelled by poverty, rampant poverty, and of course more recently the fact that the United Nations was attacked and 5 peacekeepers were killed has meant that the United Nations has pulled out of the area. Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, have withdrawn from the area. So we have a humanitarian crisis on the board, but we have a far bigger politically nuanced and tribalized conflict that is perpetuated both between North and South Sudan. There are allegations that Sudan is supporting the Morle. There are allegations that the government of South Sudan, the SPLA, is supporting the Nuer. And so we have a very, very difficult situation, and as I said, the security situation is made worse by the fact that the United Nations has withdrawn following the murder of their 5 peacekeepers in the area.
Mm-hmm. Who has been most affected by the surge in violence?
That's really the problem, it's civilians. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people displaced. We've seen women and children killed. But also, we have a country here with very, very poor infrastructure. There are very few roads, which means that humanitarian access is very, very difficult as is. It's not a matter of putting the stuff on a truck and getting it into the country. And the fact that the few roads that there are now also insecure means that these supplies aren't getting to communities. But yeah, I mean, this is really the biggest problem, and that's why the press release which we issued is also calling on the government of South Sudan as well as the international community to make sure that civilians are protected.
Mm-hmm. So, Friederike, you're saying that it's emanating from some sort of ethnical divide, but what is that underpinned by? Is it just the cattle raiding feud, or are there political undertones to the whole issue?
Yeah, of course there are political undertones. I mean, certainly the fact that the one tribe is supported by Sudan, the other one is supported by the government, and this goes back to long-standing battles between the leadership of the SPLA and the SPLM. There was a deep rift in the party in the 1990s. There are allegiances within government, especially with the deputy president or the vice president supporting one of the tribes. There have been calls for reconciliation, but these have been sort of regarded with a lot of skepticism and a lot of cynicism by people on the ground. And then, something that I think is quite important as well is that the sort of tradition of cattle rustling is one that is deeply ingrained in communities in this area, not just in South Sudan and Ethiopia and Kenya. Historically, this has been something that has been happening for a very long period of time. It's just that as a result of the long-standing conflict in the area, South Sudan and the region, there's been a conflict of over 50 years. This has meant that there's a proliferation of arms. and really having an arm or a weapon, a firearm in this region is almost sort of considered a rite of passage for a young man. And so these battles, which used to be tribal, that used to be sort of traditional and used to be relatively peaceful, have now become very violent and in many cases also lethal. So an important element of creating some kind of a resolution of this conflict is really a demilitarization of this very, very vast land. It's also the biggest and most densely populated state in South Sudan. So really there are a number of fairly major issues that make this conflict particularly bad.
Okay. Now, you've also mentioned that a troika composed of the UK, the US and Norway, as well as France and Canada and the Netherlands have called on leaders within the government to urge their people to stop the violence and to move back from confrontation and to stick to the resolutions in the All Jonglei Peace Conference. Tell us a bit about that peace conference. What exactly did that entail?
It was actually a really sort of exciting process, if I may call it that, because we had a very large coming together of people from all over Jonglei State, and in fact the conference traveled around as well. So there were sort of community-level meetings that happened in various areas within the state. And then you had sort of a national pulling together of it all. The whole process was actually chaired by South Sudan's sort of Desmond Tutu. I'd be hesitant to compare him to Tutu entirely, but his name is Archbishop Daniel Deng Bull, and he is sort of considered as a peacemaker. Sadly, he's not quite as neutral as one would want him to be. And of course, the political will wasn't entirely there in order to make sure that all parties to the conflict stuck to the agreements. But I think in terms of the process, and I think in terms of some of the outcomes, and the fact that it was a fairly inclusive dialogue, there was a solid foundation. But unfortunately, there are bigger factors at play now. There is certainly also an oil factor. The government of South Sudan has a 10% share in one of the major oil fields in Jonglei. And it seems like everybody wants a part of that. We've also very recently heard that the MTN transmitter, which actually provides cell phone access to one of the key conflict areas in the eastern part of the state, is not functional at the moment, which means that a vast part of the population there is not able to communicate what is happening to the outside world. Now, we're trying to verify with MTN at the moment why that is the case, the why, and to see whether that can be rectified. Of course, that's out of our control, but that also puts a whole new dimension on the conflict and the fact that people can't communicate to the outside world.
Yeah. And what about the humanitarian situation? I was reading that the violence could possibly displace over 200,000 South Sudanese. What have you got in terms of what is happening on humanitarian grounds?
Yeah, you have a lot of people already fleeing. I mean, you've had a lot of instability in this region for a long period of time, and I'd be loath to say it, but I think the majority of people in South Sudan are quite familiar with displacement. You've got vast amounts of refugee camps in Kenya, in northern Uganda, in Ethiopia, and IDP camps within South Sudan. So there's that movement, which is really ongoing. And as in South Africa, the reasons why people are leaving aren't only political; they are also economic. There is a disproportionate level of poverty in this area, and so a lot of the time when the drought hits or where the floods hit, and people's cattle is raided, which is a number one source of income and livelihoods, that really makes their sort of their existence very, very difficult. So you have a number of factors, and certainly displacement is ongoing, but we haven't got up-to-date numbers yet on where that is at.
So obviously, because of the cattle feuding issue, food security is definitely going to be a foreseeable problem, right?
It already is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What kind of intervention is the UN mission in the Republic of South Sudan calling for? What role are they playing currently, besides the fact that the peacekeepers have now withdrawn? Are they still playing some kind of role there?
I think so. I mean, it's sort of difficult at the moment. I think a lot of stuff is really happening sort of almost undercovers there. And we haven't had a lot of information. Hilda Johnson, who is the representative for the UN in South Sudan, has sort of echoed a lot of what the Troika has said. So they've reiterated they're sort of calling for the government to support civilians and so forth. They obviously have their hands tied at the moment, given that their peacekeepers were killed. But I think one also has to acknowledge that they do a huge amount of other good in the states and in the country as a whole. So they're providing, a huge amount of humanitarian and technical assistance to the country, which is sort of grappling with all of the challenges that a new state grapples with when it's in its sort of second year of existence. But we have been told that there are some mediations happening at the moment. We're not sure who they are with. It's all sort of held quite secret at the moment because this is obviously a very fragile political matter. So at the moment we have to sort of trust the United Nations to do what they can, but we feel that it's also important that South Africa sort of does what it can, and so IJR is trying very hard to lobby the international community to be aware and to push the government of South Sudan to do what it should as in terms of protecting its civilians.
Right. And do you agree with Genocide Watch saying that the massacres constitutes a genocide emergency?
It's obviously a strong statement, and obviously the concept of a genocide is one that is controversial in the world, but it looks very much, and we've had, as our press statement says, we've had rhetoric from the white youth that has indicated that there is definitely an element of wanting to eradicate the majority of another tribe, and so I definitely think that there are early warnings that something is happening which is why we are doing what we can at the moment to try and prevent this and raise awareness, so that we don't have a situation like in Rwanda where people knew that it was about to happen, nobody did anything.
And finally, just to end off, Friederike, the IJR, what kind of intervention are you calling for, and are you lobbying government to step in some way?
Yes, I mean, we'll be liaising with the Department of International Relations and Cooperation soon, but really we also have some funding available at the moment to actually work with local communities, because we do feel that strengthening communities at the grassroots level and sort of empowering them and using dialogue in order to bring people together to find ways of perhaps understanding one another better and tolerating one another better, obviously with the support, economic and political, of government, is perhaps a slightly more sustainable way of dealing with the situation there. But we're trying all we can at the moment, also liaising with the government of South Sudan. We'll hopefully also be playing a role in the upcoming National Reconciliation Conference in June. And so we're doing what we can from very far away.
Friederike Bubenzer, thank you so much for your time on Drive Time this afternoon. Friederike is the project leader for the South Sudan desk at the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, doing sterling work. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, Tasneem. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.